This is the Ramana Maharshi 40 Verses on Reality Satsang, a time to listen, reflect, and to deeply inquire into the self, know yourself, and be always free and at peace. Welcome. I am Richard Clarke, and I'm hosting this satsang. I'm a seeker like you, sharing what we love. I've been blessed with years of deep teaching and practice that I bring to this satsang. This week's reading from 40 Verses on Reality is verse 40. This is the last verse. Next week, I'll start reviewing the third book of Ramana's specific instructional verses, Adyasakti, or the essence of the teaching. Now to Ramana's words. Verse 40. If it is said that liberation is of three kinds, with form, or without form, or with and without form, then let me tell you that the extinction of three forms of liberation is the only true liberation. Here we are, excuse me. So, all things with forms have a beginning and have an end. Do you come and go along with the form? As long as you hold to the idea of existing as a form, you won't be able to plunge into the formless. The idea of form obscures the reality that lies beneath all forms, which is consciousness, which is our very being, which is formless. The first form we imagine is that of our seeming separate self, the I-thought from which all others rise. Forms rise in our mind when we make ideas of differences. So liberation with form has a limit, being bound to form. Liberation without form similarly has a limit, that of formlessness. Both sides of a duality, in this case form and formlessness, share their dual nature. Even liberation with or without a form is limited by the overriding context of form. Ramana tells us clearly that true liberation is beyond form. What within you is beyond form, beyond limits. This is consciousness without an object, just pure consciousness, aware only of itself. That is where Ramana directs us. Do not stop. Do not become satisfied with your progress as long as there remains any form, within or without. If there is even a shadow of a form, continue with the inquiry. Who you are is formless. Know that. Be that. Now some notes for practice. Does existence have a form? How about consciousness? Does the self have a form? Do you have a form? Now let us watch our videos for this week. First is our friend Swami Adyasakti, and he is talking also about verse 40.
Namaste, and welcome to the final episode of Uladu Narpadu. It's a beautiful, dramatic sunrise this morning, so I just had to show off the hill. And thank you all for your attention and your time, for watching all these episodes. Finally, one last verse. Know thus, if it is said, so as to suit the maturity of the mind, that the liberation which one will attain is of three kinds, with form, without form, or without form. I will say that liberation is, in truth, only the destruction of the form of the ego, which distinguishes liberation as being of three kinds, with form, without form, or without form. So this is the last word. This is the conclusion. If we read the various scriptures of the world, they describe liberation in different ways. But actually, just like the concept of liberation itself depends on the existence of the ego, similarly, the various distinctions or grades of liberation only depend on the existence of the mind. And if the mind is dissolved by proper sadhana, then there's no more argument. There's no more argument about whether one is liberated or not, or if one is liberated, what kind is it? There's just no more discussion, or what the activities of a liberated person should be. These things are more or less just academic, just mental speculation. Because if we look, for example, at the history of the enlightened beings, then we see that there's tremendous variety. No two are alike. They may reach some consensus about what is advisable to help others reach liberation. But each liberated being, each Jivan Mukta, reaches in his own unique individual way. So that seems rather paradoxical because the state of liberation is always the same. But it's not up to me to explain all this stuff. It's up to me to experience it for myself and then just try to give you an idea of what enlightenment is not. That's the only way it can be described. So what it is not is, it's not a stereotyped, standardized thing. So no description that we give can be true generally. But what we can say is that the particulars, the details, only matter if we have some rigid concept of ourselves, the ego, and the nature of the mind, liberation, the spiritual path, and so on. Now, any concept that we have is going to be defeated by the reality, because the reality is always unpredictable, spontaneous, and non-conceptual. So when we try to understand, my friend is up here waking everybody up, when we try to understand what is this liberation, we have to understand that it's complete freedom. I just want to tell you from my own point of view, my own perspective, that since I have been on this path of Arunachala Ramana, I feel so good. There's no question about whether this is the ultimate teaching or not, whether this is liberation or not, whether this is even right or wrong. There's just no question. The question doesn't even arise, because it just feels so good. And that's really the bottom line, you know? If it makes you happy, if it makes you so happy that you lose all desires for everything else, then that's it. That's the thing. Stick with it. Huh? But of course, in most cases, we find that we aren't fully satisfied. And even though some solution to the problems of life may satisfy us for some time, that it can't do so unlimitedly or unconditionally. For example, when I first got into this Vedic culture, I subscribed to a model of liberation that was called Sarupa, with form. In other words, that when you attain liberation or enlightenment or whatever you want to call it, you get a form, a spiritual form, which is permanent. And then you exist in that form in some spiritual world, along with God and other devotees who are also liberated. And then I found that one of the corollaries of this viewpoint was a rigid organization, rigid egos, rigid beliefs, which led to all kinds of abuses of power and emotional and verbal abuse of the people involved in the community. And what to speak of outsiders. So one warning flag for me was that people who have this belief of Advaita were demonized and were called all kinds of nasty names. And indeed, as far as the philosophy of Advaita and even the philosophy of Buddhism, even in the scriptures, there are, well, to put it plainly, it's the pack of lies. A bunch of stories made up to make them sound bad, but they're not accurate at all. The description of the Buddha's philosophy, even in the Vedanta Sutra, is completely counterfactual. And what to speak of other descriptions of Jainism and the philosophy of Advaita and so on like that. They're just wrong. They're not true. So when people start making up pejorative names and calling people with different beliefs bad, ill names, you know that something is wrong. Because someone who's really enlightened sees everybody as at least potentially the same, potentially divine, potentially enlightened, just like them. And so they don't condemn. Huh? They may analyze, but they don't really criticize. There's no venom in it. It's just to understand the relative values. See, for example, If I say about someone that he's like this and like that, what am I doing? I'm comparing him with somebody else, or maybe many other people, or with my expectations, or my particular rules about what things should be like or what people should be like. So if I call someone ill names and put them down, that says really more about me than it does about them. If I make up stories about somebody and spread them around and try to cause divisions between people, then that says more about my character than it does about the person I'm criticizing. So an actual enlightened person doesn't think like this. He thinks, well, some people need the security of rigid ideas and beliefs. Some people need the security blanket of very firm ego identity and like that. Some people are uncomfortable with full freedom, so they need to limit themselves. But you can't limit me. You can't even describe me. You have no idea what I'm like on the inside. So this is everybody's point of view, actually. We all know that each one of us is completely unique, beyond description, beyond categorization, and certainly beyond any kind of criticism. Because each of us is the self. Each of us is pure consciousness, unconditioned, eternal, boundless, without any limitations. So try to understand who we really are. That's the nature of the self. And that's what I've been trying to communicate in these episodes. And I hope you got something from it. I hope you got some more insight into the real nature of the reality. Uladu. What is, the way it is, and why it is the way it is, and who you are, who I am, who everybody really is, the self, Brahman, the ground of being, the substrate of unconditioned consciousness. So now I'm going to read one last line, which comes at the end, the very, very end, of all the 40 verses on reality. This Kali Venba, which is all the 40 verses on reality, Uladu Narpadu, joined together as one single verse by the gracious Sri Ramana. Yes, I know you like Ramana. Is the light which reveals the reality. So this is the reality. And I hope that you can join me very soon in this wonderful stage of enlightenment, this self-realization, that to know your real being is the satisfaction of all desires and the source of real happiness and life. So, let's say it together, Mr. Crow. Om Tat Sat. Om Hari Om.
And now we'll listen to Nome as he gives a satsang discourse, Being Alone.
Silent, non-objective knowledge of being is self-realization. It is that knowledge in which knowing and being are identical. It is said to be non-dual, for in this there is no other, no differentiation. If you know yourself in your true being, it is kevala, absolute, alone, with nothing other. If you know yourself in your real nature, you find that there is neither an individual I, nor anything to be called this, the objective portion of one's so-called experience. Rather, you find there is one absolute invariable existence, without beginning and without end. The one who knows this, the self, can only be the self and cannot be anything else. We say Brahman alone knows Brahman. The Absolute alone knows itself. Nothing else can do so. For this knowledge is neither perceptual nor conceptual, but most interior, that in which there is no separation. And because there is nothing else that actually exists, to know or not know this one self. If this is realized, there is invariable being, which is utterly non-objective and formless, and immortal. If this is realized, there is infinite consciousness, and no longer the illusion of a differentiated mind. If this is realized, there is not only Sat-Chit being consciousness, but also Ananda, bliss, for one is abiding as the very source of happiness. That source experiences itself without any interference whatsoever, because there is no other, no duality. The silent non-objective knowledge of oneself is what is to be aimed at. This is what is to be directly experienced. It is not a sensory perception. It is not a mental conception, but something far more interior and utterly non-dependent on that which is perceived or conceived. For this self-knowledge, you have only to deeply inquire as to who you really are. What has just been briefly described as being the absolute, being, consciousness, bliss, is your own existence. The existence that everyone knows and is, that no one actually doubts, ever. No one doubts his own existence. This existence, just by itself, free of any imagination, imagined limitation, superimposed attributes and such. This existence, by itself, free of any misidentification, is that, Brahman, the Self. As the Maharshi has pointed out quite lucidly, there are not two selves in the one of you. So there is not a self to be realized and one that is unrealized. There is only one self, and it alone exists for all eternity. We should not confuse it with the body, the mind, or the false assumption of existing as an ego entity. Inquire deeply within yourself, who am I? Be free from regarding what is transitory, what is objective, what is sensed, what is conceived, as being yourself. To think such were yourself would not at all be true, but would be the cause of needless illusion, bondage, and consequent suffering. The innate peace, the innate freedom, the innate happiness of the self is realized clearly and distinctly by anyone who so much as actually inquires to know one's own nature. There cannot truly be any obstruction to the knowledge of your own self. What could get between you and you? Or who could hide yourself from you? However you apply yourself in spiritual practice, let your focus be the interior knowledge of your own self, the knowledge of being. That in which no false notion of I or anything else arises, is your true state, the only real state there is. It is yourself. And it is the significance of silence.
All right, then let's take a little time and meditate, inquire, breathe in and breathe out, long, slow breaths. Feel the breath as it comes in and as it goes out. Notice that you exist. You exist, and you know that you exist without feeling it or thinking about it you just know deeper than senses or thought. Now, inquire, investigate within yourself. What is the form of consciousness? Does it have a form? Can you find a form? Can you find an edge? What about your body, your mind, your ego? They exist only due to consciousness. What is their real form? If they only exist due to consciousness, isn't consciousness their form? You exist only as consciousness. What is your form? Who am I? All right, let's close with a chant. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. Peace, peace, peace. Any questions or comments?
Sure made me feel homesick seeing that view of Arunachala.
Yes.
It's like you said, you pointed out that guy lives in the new building that was built exactly where our house was.
So we had the same view of Arunachala,
In our
and
first
we
house.
and we also had satsangs on the roof there, and the crows would come to our satsang, and maybe the crow who was there with Swamiji was one of the ones that was there at our satsangs. It seemed like they liked the satsangs, and they would be there and mostly just be quietly listening.
You're muted.
You're muted, Evelyn.
Thank you. You know, the times that I spent in India, other than at Ramana Ashram, the sound of the crows for me is it just goes right into my heart. It's like I miss them. There's
Yes,
something just very special about their sound.
yes. And we knew the
Mm-hmm.
crows knew everything.
They're pretty smart.
Yes,
Well, I think, I noticed my dogs, they love when I play Om. They
the,
just zone out.
That's
Yeah.
good.
Some people say when they meditate with their pet, the
Yeah.
pet wants to climb up on their chest.
Yes,
To
yes, my
feel it.
dogs get very quiet. So yeah, that that beingness resonates in all of them.
Yes. Yes, your
I think
dogs,
they're
our crows.
I think they're all way farther along the path of enlightenment than we are because we think too much.
Uh-huh. You could be right, Carol.
There are days when I'm sure that's correct. Yeah. So my way every day I meditate on my death. I go through that.
Yes.
Okay, the body is disintegrating, and now the mind is going, and it's very clear what remains. And that's the one way right now I carry that over to all others, especially if they've talked about their death or being afraid of their death. I can immediately see that what they actually are in
Hmm.
that particular exercise.
Hmm.
Now
Hmm.
that may vanish, you know, if I catch them in the store without their mask.
Well,
Yeah.
that's the way meditating about death is was Ramana's doorway.
Yes, yes. And I started that actually after reading the Tibetan book of Living and Dying and some of the Tibetan book of the Dead, because it just made it so clear the stages of the body shutting down
Hmm.
and that it's observable. And so my great hope is that at that time I will stay clear.
Hmm. Yes, certainly. Conscious death is something that I would hope to have. You know,
Yeah,
sometimes, from what I understand, sometimes you can't control it because the body has its own stuff that it's going through.
yeah,
But
yeah, that's true. And it does go through some stuff.
mhm,
Yeah. So but it's definitely a useful meditation contemplation
mhm,
because it always makes things abundantly clear with myself and with all other beings.
mhm. Now, Nome
Mhm.
at a retreat once had us go out in a nearby graveyard and uh, meditate for an afternoon. And
Ah,
it was an interesting experience. One of the things that I learned from it was the advantage of material riches is you can get a big headstone.
you can. Yeah, well, but who's going to prove you around to appreciate it? That's the sad part. Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for joining us today, and uh, thank you for letting me share this teaching with you. This series on Ramana's 40 verses on reality now has come to an end, and next week I'll start the review of the third book of Ramana's verses, Upadesa Saram, or the essence of the teaching. Namaste.
Namaste
Namaste.
and bye.
Bye.
Goodbye.